They said loyalty was sacred. But for the widows of Japan's samurai, that loyalty came with a price. One paid in silence, blood, and unbearable grief. When a samurai fell in battle, his widow's fate was sealed by the blade as much as his own. Some were forced to follow him into death. Through an ancient and chilling act known as junshi, the following in death. Others were condemned to a half-life of mourning, stripped of their names, shaved of their hair, and buried alive in memory long before their bodies turned to dust. In the shadows of Edo castles and Kyoto temples, the code of Bushidō demanded more than bravery on the battlefield. It demanded the sacrifice of love, womanhood, and even sanity. This is a story of devotion twisted into torment, a tale of honor's cruelest demand, and of the countless women erased beneath the legend of the samurai. Before we begin, if you find these untold histories as haunting and human as we do, remember to like this video, subscribe, and follow for more real lives and forgotten tragedies from the past. In the cold dawns of medieval Japan, where mist curled around temple roofs and the clang of steel echoed from distant training yards, the samurai stood as both hero and executioner of his own fate. To live under the code of Bushidō, the way of the warrior, was to walk in constant conversation with death. It was not seen as an ending, but companion. Every stroke of the sword, every bow to one's lord, carried within it an unspoken vow. I am already dead. This philosophy, celebrated in poems and scrolls, shaped not just a warrior, but every soul bound to him, his wife. The honorable geisha if she was trained, or the quiet lady of the household if she was not, shared that same shadow. Her life existed within the walls of her husband's honor. His victories were her pride, his shame her ruin, and his death her sentence. For in the world of the samurai, love and loyalty were braided together with a single thread, and when one snapped, so too did the other. When a samurai fell in battle, the code demanded not merely mourning but transcendence. His wife was expected to embody grief, so pure to erase her from the living world. For the wives of high-ranking warriors, this meant ritual withdrawal, hair shorn, robes of white, faces veiled. Some entered convents, taking vows of silence that lasted a lifetime. Others were compelled toward a more terrible devotion, the ritual of junshi, the following in death, in which the widow took her own life to accompany her husband into the next world. It was said that the spirit of a warrior could not rest alone, that his wife's soul must walk beside him in the afterlife, guarding his honor as she had in life. The idea seemed noble to the chroniclers who wrote of it, but beneath the poetry lay a quiet brutality. Few of these women had a choice. The weight of expectation, the eyes of clan elders, the whispers of servants, and the judgment of society formed an invisible blade at their throats. To refuse was to disgrace one's name. To obey was to die. Even the smallest gestures of grief were codified. A widow's tears were not her own. They belonged to her husband's memory, her voice, her laughter, even her very presence in the world. All became offerings. In some provinces, samurai widows were forbidden to remarry, even if they were still young. They became living ghosts, confined to the family estate, their days spent tending shrines or gazing at the arm of the man they once loved. Their lives turned into an eternal performance of sorrow. To outsiders, Bushidō was a creed of courage and discipline. To the women who lived beneath its shadow, it was a chain forged in silence. Theirs was a devotion unrecorded by historians, a loyalty that left no battlefield songs, only quiet graves and fading ink. And as Japan's feudal lords glorified the warrior's sacrifice, they forgot that the truest victims of honor were often the ones who never held a sword. In the heart of Kyoto, during the late Sengoku period, the scent of burning incense often mingled with the metallic tang of blood. Temples stood beside training grounds, monks praying while warriors prepared to die. To live as a samurai was to balance on the thin edge between serenity and slaughter, and those who loved them walked that same blade in silence. The chroniclers wrote of glorious deaths, of men who fell bravely before their lords, their names etched into clan histories and temple scrolls. Yet in those same records, the names of their widows appear only as footnotes, their fates described with chilling brevity. She followed her husband. No mention of her tears, her terror, or the trembling hands that prepared the blade. Her existence was distilled to an act of loyalty, as though her death were merely another ornament to her husband's honor. Among the noble families, junshi was praised as the highest form of devotion. When Lord Nabeshima's retainer took his own life after his master's death, the act was celebrated as divine fidelity. Songs were written, shrines were built, but when women performed the same act, there were no poems, only silence. Their bodies were wrapped hastily in white silk, their names whispered in closed rooms, their souls left to wander unacknowledged. Society revered their obedience, but never their pain. Still, not all women surrendered willingly. In some households, whispers tell of wives who resisted, who begged for life, not out of cowardice, but for the sake of their children. Some fled into the mountains, seeking refuge in temples that hid them among the nunneries. There, they shaved their heads and prayed to the Buddha, renouncing the world that had already renounced them. Others were not granted such mercy. When a clan's honor was at stake, refusal was a crime. The widow would be persuaded, shamed, or in some cases, quietly assisted to fulfill her duty. There are stories, too, of samurai who forbade their wives to die with them, men who, in their final hours, wrote letters pleading for their loved ones to live on. One such letter, found in the archives of Edo, reads, "If you love me, do not follow. Tend to our son. Let my spirit go alone." But such mercy was rare. The culture of loyalty had grown into something unyielding, larger than the human heart. And so, behind every hero sung in the annals of Japan's warrior age, there stood a woman unseen. Her loyalty assumed, her sacrifice demanded. In life, she was bound by duty. In death, she became its proof. The moment a samurai's body was brought home, the house itself became a tomb. The walls, once echoing with children's laughter and the rhythm of wooden sandals, fell into an unnatural quiet. The air thickened with the scent of incense, and every object, the armor stand, the folded banners, the lacquered tea set, seemed to mourn. For the widow, this was the beginning of her vigil, the long passage between life and death, where grief was no longer private, but ceremony to be observed and judged. Her first act was purification. She bathed her husband's body, washing away the dust and blood with trembling hands, her tears mixing with the cold water. It was not uncommon for her to do this alone, guided only by temple priests who chanted sutras from the next room. In that moment, she ceased to be a wife in the living sense. She became a caretaker of the dead, her touch now belonging to a soul that had already departed. When the final cloth was drawn over his face, the house entered mourning, and so did she, the widow dressed in white, the color of death in Japan, symbolizing both purity and surrender. Her hair, once oiled and tied with ribbons, was unbound and left to hang in disarray. Some cut it short as a sign of devotion. Others burned it with their husband's armor. Around her wrist, she wore a string of Buddhist beads, each one a prayer for his journey and a chain for her own captivity. The rituals that followed were precise, each step a measured display of fidelity. For 49 days, she was forbidden to speak of anything but her husband's virtues. Meals were sparse, often only rice and water, taken kneeling before his altar. Every dawn, she lit incense and whispered his name, not once, but 7 times, so that his spirit would not lose its way between worlds. Her voice would crack, yet she continued, because silence itself could be interpreted as negligence. Visitors came, clan elders, relatives, priests, all cloaked in solemnity. They bowed, offered condolences, and spoke of her husband's bravery. None asked how she was. Her face was a mask. Her grief was not to be seen as weakness, but as duty fulfilled. Behind the thin paper walls, she sometimes wept in secret, biting her sleeve to muffle the sound. The servants pretended not to hear. Outside, the world moved on. The crops were planted. The soldiers marched. The cherry blossoms bloomed, only to fall again like flakes of ash. But within the widow's chambers, time had stopped. Each night she lay beside the folded garments her husband once wore. Her body curled toward the absence that consumed her. In dreams, she saw his face, not as it was in life, but pale and distant, always turning away. In those long days of ritual mourning, whispers would often begin among the elders. Talk of junshi, of whether her devotion might reach its natural conclusion. Some believed it was her destiny. Others merely watched, waiting to see if she would take the final step herself. For in the eyes of her world, love unfinished was a kind of shame. As the weeks passed, grief became a kind of discipline, an art form of sorrow measured in silence and breath. The widow's world narrowed to the dim glow of oil lamps and the murmurs of the temple bells at dawn. Her body thin from fasting, her eyes hollow beneath sleepless nights. Yet, even in her weakness, she was watched. Every movement, every expression, was scrutinized by the household, for her pain was a reflection of her husband's worth. In samurai society, mourning was not simply personal. It was political. The way a widow grieved could raise or tarnish her family's reputation. A woman who wailed too loudly brought shame. One who did not weep enough was called heartless, and one who lingered too long in despair risked being accused of clinging to the world. There was no right way to suffer, only the right way to appear suffering. So, she learned to master performance of grief, to bow at the right angle, to lower her eyes at the right moment, to let tears fall when others could see them. During these 49 days, she existed between the living and the dead. It was said that her husband's soul hovered near, seeking the path to the next world. Some nights, she lit candles and spoke to him in whispers, her words trembling like the flames. "Did you find peace? Do you still remember me?" The only reply was the wind against the paper walls, a sigh that felt like the echo of his final breath. But behind these rituals lay the growing shadow of decision. When the last incense stick burned on the 49th night, the priest would chant the kaimyo, the posthumous name that marked her husband's passage to the afterlife. For most women, this moment should have closed a chapter of mourning. Yet for many samurai widows, it only opened another, the unspoken expectation that she too might soon follow. The household elders would speak softly of duty, of the purity of junshi. They would remind her that a warrior's soul could wander without his wife's spirit beside him. The suggestion was not made as an order, but as a ghostly persuasion, a quiet tightening of the noose woven from centuries of honor and superstition. A widow who resisted might be labeled faithless, her family disgraced. And so the walls seemed to close around her, every shrine and scroll whispering that her purpose had already ended with her husband's breath. Some widows prepared in secret. Their resolve formed like steel in the stillness of night. They wrote final letters in careful brushstrokes, thanking their ancestors for the gift of devotion. They knelt before the household altar, pressing their foreheads to the tatami mats until their skin bruised. Others hesitated, trembling between the pull of death and the fragile instinct to live. In those hearts, a war raged far quieter than any fought with swords, a battle between the expectation of honor and the desperate whisper of life. When dawn came, she rose again to light the incense. The smoke coiled upward like a soul departing, and in its haze, she saw her husband's face fading into eternity. She knew then that her vigil was nearing its end. But whether that meant freedom or finality, only she and the blade could decide. Night fell heavy over the widow's chambers, pressing the air into stillness. The paper lanterns flickered low, casting trembling light over the tatami mats where she sat motionless, her white mourning robe pooling like spilled moonlight. Beyond the shoji doors, the cicadas had gone quiet, as if nature itself held its breath. It was on such nights that the choice was made, when grief hardened into resolve and the living world slipped quietly out of reach. The practice of junshi, following one's lord or husband in death, was not performed in haste. It was ritualized, deliberate, and mercilessly calm. Everything had its order, its symbolism. The widow was expected to meet her death with dignity, not as a victim but as a vessel of loyalty. Yet behind that calm exterior lay a human terror few could imagine. For no amount of ritual could silence a heartbeat that still wanted to live. Before the act, she would cleanse herself with water, washing away both impurity and fear. Her hair, which had hung loose in mourning, was combed and tied neatly, not as a woman, but as a soul preparing to depart. She dressed again in white, her sleeves bound so they would not flutter as she knelt. A servant, often another woman who had also lost her husband, brought the small writing tray and inkstone. The widow dipped the brush in ink and began her final message. Some wrote prayers for forgiveness. Others simply left their names, as if to say, "I was here. I existed once." Then came the blade, a short dagger, sheathed in black or wrapped in cloth, To conceal its glint, it was usually prepared by a family retainer or priest. Some households possess a blade passed down through generations, reserved solely for this ritual, polished in oil like an heirloom of despair. It was placed before her, its weight seeming to hum with unspoken history. As the moment approached, she bowed 3 times toward her husband's altar. Her voice, soft but steady, recited the Nembutsu, a Buddhist invocation to the Amida Buddha, calling for mercy and rebirth. Her attendants, if any, remained silent, their faces a mask of composure. To interrupt was forbidden. The act was hers alone. Some widows took poison before the cut, mixing ground camellia seeds with sake to dull the senses. Others chose clarity, believing that pain purified the soul. When the blade touched her skin, the world seemed to dissolve, the sound of her own breath, the creak of the floor, the faint chirp of insects outside. There was no screaming, no struggle, only the slow, deliberate surrender of life. And yet, even in this final ritual of supposed honor, there lingered a deep cruelty. For many of these women did not die from belief but from fear. Fear of shame, of dishonoring their children, of becoming the subject of whispers in the marketplace. They died because their society had left them no language for grief except silence and death. When dawn broke over the house, the servants found her kneeling still, the blade fallen from her hand, her body folded forward in a final bow. They said her face was peaceful, as if she had joined her husband at last. But no one could know what thoughts had passed in those final moments, what longing, what regret. Only the silence remained, the silence of centuries, still echoing in the faint trace of ink where her name once trembled on paper. The morning after such a death, the household moved with ritual precision, their grief hidden behind the same order that had governed her life. Servants draped the corridors in white cloth. The priest arrived before sunrise, carrying the sutras and the scents of incense that trailed a slow, gray veil through the rooms. No one spoke her name aloud. To do so was to disturb the fragile boundary between the worlds, to call back a spirit that was meant to go. Her body, still dressed in its white robe, was lifted gently and laid upon a mat of woven rushes. Her hair was neatly arranged, her hands folded around the string of prayer beads. On her lips, a trace of vermilion powder was placed, the final gesture of purity. Outside, the first light fell over the rooftops, indifferent and serene. The world did not pause for her. According to custom, the priest recited the Heart Sutra, each chant a bridge for her soul. The household knelt, foreheads pressed the floor. Yet, even in reverence, there was unease. Though junshi was praised in poems and chronicles, many feared that such deaths brought unrest to the household, that spirits bound by grief did not easily leave. In some provinces, widows who took their own lives were buried outside the family cemetery, their graves left unmarked. To the living, honor was a story, but to the dead, it was a prison. For those who remained, the aftermath was a strange quiet. Children whispered her name in secret. Maids left offerings of flowers at the altar. The elders would speak of her as a model of devotion, an example to be followed. Yet when night came, the same elders sometimes claimed to hear her voice in the corridors, soft as wind through paper screens. They said her spirit lingered, not out of pride, but out of sorrow. The old stories tell these ghosts, the Anaborii, the spirits of women whose love had been turned against them, doomed to wander between this world and the next, forever searching for the peace they were denied. And still, the cycle continued. Across Japan, from the fortified castles of Kyushu to the misted valleys of Edo, widows repeated the same ritual, generation after generation. No one questioned it openly. The samurai believed that loyalty was eternal, that the bond between husband and wife transcended the flesh. To break that chain, even in mercy, was to defy the very code that sustained their world. But beneath the armor of duty, something began to stir, a quiet rebellion born not anger, but of exhaustion. Some widows chose a different path. Instead of taking the blade, they fled into the monasteries, seeking refuge in the folds of Buddhist silence. There, among nuns and candles, they shaved their heads and recited the sutras not for the dead, but for the living, for themselves. Their defiance was whispered, never written, but it was real. It was in these hidden corners of devotion and resistance that the old code began to crack. For every woman who felt a blade, another refused it. choosing to bear the burden of memory rather than die for an idea that had already consumed too many lives. And though history would forget most of their names, their quiet survival spoke louder than any act of ritual death. The samurai world had built its honor upon silence, but even silence, when stretched across centuries, begins to tremble. By the dawn of the 17th century, Japan was changing. The endless wars that had torn the islands apart for generations were beginning to fade into memory under the new Tokugawa shogunate. Peace, fragile, unfamiliar, and heavily policed, began to settle across the land. The clang of swords gave way to the rhythm of commerce and poetry. Samurai, once defined by battle, now serve as bureaucrats and scholars. Yet, while the world evolved around them, the ghosts of their past clung stubbornly to the code that had built their power. Among the most haunting of those relics was junshi. The ritual that had once embodied absolute loyalty had grown into a moral dilemma for rulers who now sought order rather than glory. Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, the architect of peace, despised the practice. He saw it not as an act of virtue, but as waste, the needless destruction of life and lineage. If the dead demand company, he was said to remark, let them wait in silence. His words, recorded in the scrolls of his court, carried the weight of authority. And so in 1663, junshi was officially banned. But laws cannot so easily undo centuries of belief. The decree reached the provinces like a whisper against a storm, and in many samurai households, the old code remained stronger than the shogun's will. Widows continued to die in secret. Some families falsified records, claiming illness or accident. Others bribed priests to conduct the rites quietly, far from the city's gaze. For them, the law was an insult, a stain upon their heritage. To obey it was to dishonor their ancestors. Within these homes, the conflict tore families apart. Sons begged their mothers to live. Elders demanded that they fulfill their duty. There are stories of daughters who stood between their grieving mothers and the dagger, only to be struck down or cast out. There were also men, younger samurai, raised in a world of uneasy peace, who began to question the meaning of the code itself. If loyalty led only to death, was it truly loyalty, or was it fear disguised as faith? Even priests were divided. The Buddhist sects that once sanctified junshi began to split in doctrine. Some argued that suicide for loyalty was noble if the heart was pure. Others condemned it as attachment, a refusal to release worldly desire. The temples, once silent witnesses, became places of debate. In their courtyards, incense mingled with argument, and the chants of the sutras were joined by the murmur of dissent. And yet, beyond the walls of politics and faith, the widows remained at the center of this quiet war. For them, the ban changed little. The expectations persisted. The whispers endured. The old codes lingered like the scent of blood in the earth. A woman's worth was still measured by her obedience to a dead man's honor. The law could outlaw junshi, but it could not outlaw devotion, or the suffocating shape that devotion had taken. In this uneasy balance between new order and ancient grief, Japan stood at a crossroads. The samurai's sword had been sheathed, but the invisible blades, those that claimed the hearts and lives of their widows, still gleamed beneath the surface of a nation struggling to define its soul. The decree against junshi rippled through Japan like a whisper in a monastery hall. Heard by all, obeyed by few, the shogunate's officials wrote proclamations in elegant brushstrokes, posting them at the gates of castles and temples. Yet in the provinces, far from Edo's gaze, the ink barely had time to dry before it was ignored. In the silence of their homes, widows still prepared the same rites their mothers and grandmothers had known. The laws of men might have changed, but the laws of honor, carved deep into the marrow of the samurai, remained untouched. In many households, the ritual now unfolded in secrecy. The widow's chambers became both sanctuary and prison, guarded not by warriors but by silence. Only a few trusted servants would know what was to come. The family elders, faces drawn and solemn, would light candles and place the ancestral armor beside the altar. When the act was done, they would whisper to the local priest, who would bless the body quietly before dawn. The death was recorded as illness, the blood quickly washed away. In this way, junshi survived, hidden beneath the mask of obedience, like a forbidden prayer recited behind closed doors. But the cracks in the old order deepened. Younger generations, born into peace, began to see the cruelty in these hidden sacrifices. To them, the widows' deaths were not acts of purity but remnants of a dying age. A few daring voices, poets, scholars, and monks, began to speak against the practice. In their writings, they called junshi a shadow of the sword, a ghost of a world that refused to accept its own peace. These words circulated quietly among educated circles. Yet even whispers were dangerous in a society that prized conformity. Some were silenced. Others disappeared. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. Within the samurai class itself, the conflict grew unbearable. Men who once prided themselves on unyielding loyalty began to question what that loyalty demanded. A retainer might obey his lord unto death, but could he ask the same of his wife? Letters from this period reveal moments of startling tenderness. Dying warriors urging their wives to live, to raise their children, to remember them not with a blade but with prayers. One letter, found in a temple archive in Nagasaki, reads, "The path of loyalty ends with me. Let yours begin anew." It was a quiet act of rebellion wrapped in the language of love. For the widows, the choice became a torment of conscience. To die was to uphold the old world. To live was to betray it. Either way, they bore the burden of judgment. Some found refuge in nunneries that began to multiply under the Tokugawa peace, secluded places where women could live out their days chanting sutras, unseen by the world. These women, shaven-headed and silent, carried the weight of two lives, their own and the one they had been forbidden to mourn freely. By the close of the 17th century, junshi was no longer common, but neither was it gone. It persisted like a ghostly echo, less a ritual than a memory, haunting the spaces where swords had once ruled and silence had once been mistaken for honor. And though the Tokugawa shogunate had triumphed in unifying Japan, it could not unify the heart of its people. The samurai had laid down their arms, but their women were still fighting unseen wars, not on battlefields, but within the unyielding chambers of custom, grief, and expectation. The ban had drawn a line in law, but the soul of the nation stood uncertain on either side. Between duty and love, between the old world and the new, Japan waited, poised on the edge of transformation, listening to the last faint murmurs of a code that had demanded everything and given nothing in return. Centuries passed, and the age of the samurai faded into legend. The clatter of armor, the gleam of the katana, the banners that once fluttered over blood-soaked fields, all were replaced by the hum of modern life. Yet behind the new facades of cities and the soft paper glow of lanterns, something of that old world lingered. The ghosts of those who had died for honor, especially the women who followed their husbands into the silence, refused to disappear. In the quiet corners of Kyoto and Edo, the old houses whispered their names. Monks spoke of apparitions seen kneeling before ancestral shrines long after their deaths. Travelers told tales of pale women drifting through temple gardens, their faces veiled, their robes white as snow. To the common people, these were not merely stories but warnings that loyalty taken too far could trap the soul in endless mourning. The priests called them anaborii, women's spirits bound by devotion and despair, unable to find rest because their deaths had not been their own. As Japan entered the Meiji era, sweeping aside the feudal system and the samurai caste itself, the stories took on new meaning. Scholars began to record them, poets began to reinterpret them, and artists painted their sorrow in vivid strokes. Pale widows on the full moon, hands clasped in prayer, their eyes turned toward husbands who no longer existed even in memory. In these portrayals, the women were no longer symbols of loyalty, but of loss. Their silence, once praised as virtuous, came to represent the voiceless suffering of generations bound to a code written by men. The more Japan modernized, the more its people began to look back, not with pride, but with unease. Historians unearthed temple records of junshi long forgotten, written in the same neat, detached brush that chronicled births and wars. The dates blurred together, but the names, so many names, told the truth the code had hidden. These women had not vanished willingly. They had been erased, and yet their presence endured. Even today, in old samurai towns like Kanazawa or Kagoshima, there are families who still leave offerings at the shrines of faithful wives. A bowl of rice, a folded paper crane, a small cup of sake. They say it is to honor courage, but perhaps it is also to soothe guilt. The unspoken knowledge that their peace was bought with another silence. Literature of the late 19th century gave their stories new voices. Writers like Mori Oge and Higuchi Ichiyo began to question the romanticism of Bushidō, exposing its cruelty and contradiction. The widow who once would have died beside her husband became, in their words, a tragic figure of endurance, a mirror reflecting the sorrow of a nation that had mistaken obedience for virtue. Still, the line between admiration and remorse blurred. Statues were built in their memory, and poems recited in their name. But in truth, these gestures did not bring them peace. They were memorials erected by those who had finally learned to mourn what they once glorified. And so, Japan moved forward, haunted by its own past. The sword had long been set aside, but the echoes of its edge could still be felt. In the way women bowed before portraits of their ancestors, in the way silence still carried more weight than speech. The code of death and devotion had ended in law, yet lived on in the quiet rhythms of remembrance. For some ghosts cannot be exorcised by decree. They must be remembered, not as symbols of honor, but as human beings who suffered beneath it. The true legacy of the samurai widow was not carved into stone or written in scrolls. It was carried in the quiet defiance that followed. In the decades after the Meiji Restoration, as Japan opened its ports to the Western world and began to question its own traditions, a new generation of women started to speak. They did not wear armor, nor wield swords, yet their rebellion was no less dangerous. They wielded words, poems, essays, diaries, and through them, they began to dismantle the myth that honor demanded silence. One of the earliest among them, a poet named Yusano Akiko, ignited a fire with her verses. She wrote of love and longing, not as a woman confined to duty, but as a soul demanding to live. Her words scandalized the old order. The idea that a woman's life could belong to herself, not to a man's memory, was heresy to those raised under the shadow of Bushidō. Yet her courage marked a turning point. The ghosts of the old widows, bound to loyalty by blade and vow, seemed to stir in the collective memory. It was as if, through these new voices, they finally began to breathe again. Still, the stories of junshi, those who died following their husbands into death, lingered as cautionary tales. Historians debated their meaning. Were they symbols of purity or victims of coercion? The answer was never simple. For every tale of a devoted widow lighting incense before her husband's armor, there was another of a young woman cornered by family, by expectation, by shame. Even centuries later, these questions cut deep. The struggle between devotion and autonomy, between loyalty and the right to live, remain one of Japan's most painful inheritances. Modern Japan, for all its steel and glass, still bows to memory. In certain Shinto shrines, the names of samurai wives are written on tablets beside their husbands, their souls linked in ritual prayers. But if one listens closely, there is a subtle dissonance in those ceremonies, a hesitation in the chant, a pause too long. It is as if even the priests know the prayers cannot wash away the sorrow of the past. Perhaps that is the true punishment of the code, not the deaths it claimed, but the silence it left behind. The silence that still hangs over families who speak of their ancestors with reverence but never with pity. The silence that follows every retelling of a widow's devotion. The unspoken thought that she might have wanted to live. In the flicker of temple candles, in the haunting notes of a shakuhachi flute, one can still feel the ache of their unspoken words. Their tragedy has become a mirror reflecting the dangers of blind obedience, of love twisted into sacrifice. The samurai widow, once exalted as the ideal of virtue, now stands as one of history's most haunting figures, a reminder how easily devotion can be turned into a weapon. And yet, even in that darkness, there is something sacred, the courage of those who endured, who carried the weight of honor, without losing the spark of humanity beneath it. The ghosts of honor do not wail to be forgotten, but to be understood, to remind us that love, stripped of freedom, becomes only another form of death. So when the wind sighs to the bamboo groves of Kyoto, or when moonlight spills across the stones of an old castle ruin, some say it is not the spirits of samurai who linger there, but the whispers of their widows, finally telling their stories to the night.